Chapter 12. The Night Wind's Mystery.
After the departure of Lawler on the night of Gary Warden's visit to the Hamlin cabin, silence, vast and deep, reigned inside. The last golden shadows from the sinking sun were turning somber shades of twilight as Ruth came to the door and peered outward, to see Lawler riding away. For a long time the girl watched Lawler, her face burning with shame over what had happened, her senses revolting from the realization of the things Lawler knew concerning her father. Then she seated herself on the threshold of the doorway, watching the long shadows steal over the plains. She loved Lawler, she never had attempted to deny it, not even to herself, and she had found it hard to restrain herself when he had stood outside the door of her room gravely pleading with her. Only pride had kept her from yielding, the humiliating conviction that she was not good enough for him, or rather that her father's crimes had made it impossible for her to accept him upon a basis of equality. She felt that Lawler would take her upon any terms. Indeed, his manner while in the cabin shortly before convinced her of that. But she did not want to go to him under those conditions. She would have felt, always, as though pity for her had influenced him. She felt that she would always be searching his eyes, looking for signs which would indicate that he was thinking of her father, and he was certain to think of him. Those thoughts would come in spite of his efforts to forget. They would be back of every glance he threw at her. They would be lurking always near to humiliate her. The conviction sent a shudder over her. The girl's mental processes were not involved. They went directly, unwaveringly to the truth as her heart revealed it, as she knew it must be. If there was any subconscious emotion in her heart or mind from which might spring chaotic impulses that would cloud her mental vision, she was not aware of it. Her thoughts ran straight and true to the one outstanding, vivid, and overwhelming fact that she could not marry Cain Lawler because to marry him would mean added humiliation. Greatness, Ruth knew, was hedged about by simplicity. Lawler was as direct in his attitude toward life, and to herself, as she. There was about him no wavering, no indecision, no mulling over in his mind the tangled threads of thought that would bring confusion. The steel fiber of his being was unelastic. He met the big questions of life with an eagerness to solve them instantly. He wanted her, she knew, but she assured herself that she could not bring upon him the shame and ignominy of a relationship with a cattle thief, no matter how intensely he wanted her. That would be doing him an injustice, and she would never agree to it. But it hurt, this knowledge that she could not marry Lawler, that she must put away from her the happiness that might be hers for the taking, that she must crush the eager impulses that surged through her, that she must repulse the one man who could make her heart beat fast, the man for whom she longed with an intensity that sometimes appalled her. She got up after a while and lighted an oil lamp, placing it upon the table in the big room. She closed the door and then dropped listlessly into a chair beside the table, her eyes glistening, her lips quivering. The future was somber in aspect, almost hopeless it seemed. And yet into her mind as she sat there crept a determination, a resolution to tell her father what she knew, to tell him that she could no longer endure the disgrace of his crimes. That meant, of course, that she would have to leave him, for she knew he was weak, and that he had been drawn into crime, and had not the moral strength to redeem himself. When about midnight she heard the beating of hoofs near the cabin, she sat very quiet, rigid, still determined, her eyes flashing with resolution. She was standing near the door of her room when her father entered, and as he stood for an instant blinking at the light, trying to accustom his eyes to it after riding for some time through the darkness, she watched him, noting, as she had noted many times before, the weakness of his mouth and the furtive gleam of his eyes. He had not always been like that. Before the death of her mother she had always admired him, aware of the sturdiness of his character, of his rugged manliness, and of his devotion to her mother. Adversity had changed him, had weakened him, and now, watching him, noting the glow in his eyes when he saw her, the pathetic worship in them, her heart protested the decision that her cold judgment had made, and she ran to him with a little quavering, pitying cry and buried her face on his shoulder, shuddering, murmuring sobbingly, "Oh, Daddy, oh, Daddy, what have you done?" He stood rigid, his eyes wide with astonishment, looking down at her as she clung to him as though wondering over a sudden miracle. For he knew she was not an emotional girl, and this evidence of emotion almost stunned him. "Why, honey?" He patted her hair and her cheeks and hugged her tightly to him. And presently he gently disengaged himself and held her at arm's length, peering into her face. And then when her clear eyes met his, her gaze direct and searching even though her cheeks had paled, his eyes drooped and his arms fell to his sides. "I've done enough, Ruth," he said soberly. Why, Daddy? Why did you do it? Oh, you have made it so hard for me. There, honey, he consoled, reaching out and patting her shoulders again. I've been a heap ornery, but it ain't going to happen again. His eyes shone through a mist that had come into them. I've been talking with Kane Lawler, and he opened my eyes. I've been blind, Ruth, blind to what it all meant to you. And from now on, I'm going straight as a die, Ruth, he went on, when he saw incredulity in her gaze. I wasn't to tell you. I reckon Lawler would half kill me if he knowed I was telling you. But there ain't no use. Did you give your word to Lawler, Daddy? I sure did, but I've got to tell you, Ruth. Meb, you knowin' will sort of help me to go through with it. Kane Lawler was here this mornin'. He come here to see me about a Circle L cow that I was runnin', my brand, on the night before. He talked mighty plain to me, and earnest. He offered me a job over to the Circle L, and I took it. I rode over there this afternoon, and Lawler's straw boss put me to work. Then tonight Lawler rode in and took me out by the corral. He gave it to me straight there. He is going to restock my place and give me a chance to get on my feet. He is going to put his shoulder behind me, he says, and make me run a straight trail. Tacking a mortgage on the place to secure him. He give me a letter to his mother, Cyan. I was to have what stock I wanted, and I'm to repay him when I get around to it. Honey, I've got a chance, and I'm never going to slip again. Ruth walked to the door and threw it open, standing on the threshold and gazing out into the dull moonlight across the vast sweep of plain from which came the low moaning of the night wind, laden with mystery. For a long time, as she stood there, pride fought a savage battle with duty. Her face was pallid, her lips tight, clenched, and shame unutterable gripped her. To be sure, Lawler had enjoined her father to silence, and it was evident that she was not to know. Still, she did know, and Lawler had added an obligation, a debt, to the already high barrier that was between them. Yet she dared not evade the obligation, for that would be robbing her father of a chance over which he seemed to exult, a chance which promised the reformation for which she had prayed. Her heart was like lead within her, a dull weight that threatened to drag her down, and yet she felt a pulse of thankfulness. For if her father really meant to try, if he should succeed in redeeming himself in Lawler's eyes and in her own, she might one day be able to go to Lawler with no shame in her eyes, with the comforting assurance that her father had earned the right to hold his head up among men. To be sure, there always would be the shadow of the past mistake lurking behind, but it would be the shadow of a mistake corrected, of a black gulf bridged. Her father was waiting when she finally turned to him, waiting, his chin on his chest, his face crimson with shame. Ruth, girl, you ain't going to judge me too harsh, are you? He begged. Once more she yielded to the pathetic appeal in his eyes. She ran to him again, holding him tightly to her. A cool gust swept in through the open doorway, the night wind, laden with mystery. But the girl laughed and snuggled closer to the man, and the man laughed hoarsely, vibrantly, in a voice that threatened to break.
Chapter 13. The Invisible Menace.
At the close of the second day, the big trail herd halted at the edge of the vast level over which it had come. The herd had been driven 40 miles. Cattle, men, and horses had passed through a country which was familiar to them, a country featured by long grama grass, greasewood, and cactus plants. There was no timber on the plains. The gray of the grama grass and the bare stretches of alkali shone white in the glare of a sun that swam in a cloudless sky of deepest azure. Except for the men, the cattle, the horses, and the two slow-moving, awkward-looking canvas-covered wagons, there had been no evidence of life on the great plain. In a silence unbroken save by the clashing of horns, the bleating and bawling of the cattle, the ceaseless creaking of the wagons, and the low voices of the men, the cavalcade moved eastward. The wind that swept over the plains was chill. It carried a tang that penetrated, that caused the men, especially in the early morning, to turn up the collars of their woolen shirts as they rode, a chill that brought a profane protest from the tawny-haired giant who had disclosed to Lawler the whereabouts of Joe Hamlin that night in the Circle L bunkhouse. The first camp had been made on the Wolf, at a shallow about 5 miles north of the 2-bar, Hamlin's ranch, and with the clear, sparkling, icy water of the river on his face, and glistening beads of it on his colorless eyelashes, the giant had growled to several of his brother cowboys, who were likewise performing their ablutions at the river. This damn wind is worse'n a Kansas regular. You lean agin it and it freezes you. You turn your back to it and you've got to go to clawing icicles out of your back. Why in hell can't they have a wind that has got some sense to it? It ain't sea cold, Shorty, jibed a slender puncher with a saturnine eye and a large mobile mouth. Kells, grinned the giant, your voices froze right now. And yet the men enjoyed the cold air. It had a tonic effect upon them. They were energetic, eager, and always ravenously hungry. The cook offered testimony on that subject, unsolicited. I never seen a bunch of mavericks that gobbled more grub than this here outfit, he stated on the second morning. Or that swilled more coffee, he added. Seems like all they come on this drive for is to eat. Toward the close of the second day, corrugations began to appear in the level. Little ridges and valleys broke the monotony of travel. Rocks began to dot the earth. The gray grass disappeared. The barren stretches grew larger and more frequent, and the yucca and the lance-like octilla began to appear here and there. The trend of the trail had been upward all afternoon. Gradual at first, hardly noticeable. But as the day drew to a close, the cattle mounted a slope, progressing more slowly, and the horses hitched to the wagons began to strain in the harness. The rise seemed to be endless, to have no visible terminus, for it went up and up until it melted into the horizon, like the brow of a hill against the sky. But when, after hours of difficult travel, herd and men gained the summit, a broad, green, brown mesa lay before them. The mesa was miles wide and ran an interminable distance eastward. Looking back over the way they had come, the men could see that the level over which they had ridden for the past 2 days was in reality the floor of a mighty valley. Far away into the west they could see a break in the mesa, where it sloped down to merge into the plains near Willits. The men knew that beyond that break ran the steel rails that connected the town with Red Rock, their destination. But it was plain to them that the rails must make a gigantic curve somewhere in the invisible distance, or that they ran straight into a range of low mountains that fringed the northern edge of the mesa. Lawler enlightened the men at the campfire that night. The railroad runs almost straight from Willits, he said. There is a tunnel through one of the mountains and other tunnels east of it, and there is a mountain gorge with plenty of water in it, where the railroad runs on a shelving level blasted out of the wall. The mountains form a barrier that keeps Willits and the Wolf River section blocked in that direction. It is the same south of here, the only difference being that in the south there is no railroad until you strike the Southern Pacific, and that is a long distance to drive cattle. When the herd began to move the following morning, Blackburn sent them over the mesa for several miles, and then began to head them down a gradual slope, leaving the mesa behind. There was a faint trail, narrow, over which in other days cattle had been driven, for the grass had been trampled and cut to pieces, and in some places there were still prints of hoofs in the baked soil. The slope grew sharper, narrowing as it descended, and the cattle moved down it in a sinuous living line, until the leaders were out of sight far around a bend at least a mile distant. Blackburn was at the head of the herd with 3 men, riding some little distance in front of the cattle, inspecting the trail. Lawler and the others were holding the stragglers at the top of the mesa, endeavoring to prevent the crowding and confusion which always results when massed cattle are being held at an outlet. It was like a crowd of eager humans attempting to gain entrance through a doorway at the same instant. The cattle were plunging, jostling. The concerted impulse brought the inevitable confusion, a jam that threatened frenzy. By Lawler's orders, the men drew off, and the cattle, relieved of the menace which always drives them to panic in such a situation, began to filter through and to follow their leaders down the narrow trail. Down, always down, the trail led, growing narrower gradually, until at last cattle and men were moving slowly on a rocky floor with the sheer wall of the mesa on one side and towering mountains on the other. The clatter of hoofs, the clashing of horns, the bellowing, the rumble of the wagons over the rocks, and the ring of iron-shod hoofs created a bedlam of sound which echoed and re-echoed from the towering walls until the uproar was deafening. Shorty, the tawny-haired giant, was riding close to Lawler. He never had ridden the trail, though he had heard of it. He leaned over and shouted to Lawler, "Kinney's Cayenne, ain't it?" Lawler nodded. "Well," shouted Shorty, "it is a Lulu, ain't it?" For a short time the trail led downward. Then there came a level stretch, smooth, damp. The day was hours old, and the sun was directly overhead. But down in the depths of the Sion it was cool, and a strong wind blew into the faces of the men. The herd was perhaps an hour passing through the Sion, and when Lawler and Shorty, riding side by side, emerged from the cool gloom, They saw the cattle descending a shallow gorge, going toward a wide slope which dipped into a basin of mammoth size. Lawler knew the place. He had ridden this trail many times in the years before the coming of the railroad, and when he reached the crest of the slope and looked out into the hazy, slumbering distance, he was not surprised, though his eyes quickened with appreciation for its beauty. 30 miles of virgin land lay before him, basking in the white sunlight, a green-brown bowl through which flowed a river that shimmered like silver. The dark bases of mountains loomed above the basin at the eastern edge, a serrated range with lofty peaks that glowed white in the blue of the sky. South and north were other mountains, somber purple giants with pine-clad slopes and gleaming peaks, majestic, immutable. Looking down from where he sat on Red King, Lawler could see the head of the herd far down the ever-broadening trail. The leaders were so far away that they seemed to be mere dots, black dots moving in an emerald lake. The cattle, too, had glimpsed the alluring green that spread before them, and at a little distance from Lawler and several of the other men they were running, eager for the descent. "She is a whopper, ain't she?" said Shorty's voice at Lawler's side. "I've seen a heap of this man's country, but never nothing like that. I reckon if the Lord had spread her out a little mite further, she'd have took in mighty near the whole earth. It is mighty plain he wasn't skimping things, none. Anyway, when he made this here little hollow." He grinned as he rode, and then waved a sarcastic hand toward the cattle. "Look at 'em runnin', you'd think. Having projected around this here country for a year or so, they'd be better judges. They're thinkin' they'll be bury-eying their mugs in that right pretty grass in about 15 seconds, judgin' from the way they're hittin' the breeze toward it, and it'll take them half a day to get down there." Shorty was a better judge of distance than the cattle, for it was afternoon when the last of the herd reached the level floor of the basin. They spread out to graze industriously, the men not caring, knowing they would not stray far from such a wealth of grass. By the time the chuck wagon had come to a halt and the cook had clambered stiffly from his seat to prepare the noonday meal, Lawler and the others saw the horse wrangler and his assistant descending the long slope with the Fiftermuda too. The horses had fallen far behind, and Lawler rode to meet them, curious to know what had happened. When he rode up, the horse wrangler, a man named Garvin, a stocky individual with keen, inquiring eyes, advanced to meet him. "Boss," he said shortly, "there is something mighty wrong going on behind us. Me and Ed, my helper, has been kind of hanging back, being sort of curious. They's a bunch of ornery-looking guys trailing us. I first saw 'em after we'd struck the bottom of that cañon. They was just coming around that big bend, and I saw 'em. They lit out, turnin' tail. Mebbe figurin' I hadn't seen 'em, but pretty soon I seen 'em again, sort of sneakin' behind us. I reckon if they was square guys, they wouldn't be sneakin' like that, eh?"
Chapter 14. Lawler's Nerve.
When Lawler spoke to Blackburn regarding the news that had been communicated to him by the horse wrangler, Blackburn suggested that himself and several of the Circle L men ride back to ascertain the object of the trailers. "We'll ride back and make 'em talk," he declared heatedly. Lawler, however, would not agree, telling Blackburn that the trail was free, and that until the men made some hostile move, there was no reason why they should be approached. So the men selected new mounts from their strings in the Suramuda, and again started the big herd forward. Lawler rode for a time with Garvin, keeping an alert eye on the back trail, but though he could see far up the cañon where the trail, white with dust from the passing of the herd, wound its sinuous way upward into the dark recesses between the towering mesa walls, he could see no sign of life or movement. The non-appearance of the mysterious riders was suspicious, for if their intentions were friendly, they would have come boldly on. In fact, if they were abroad upon an honest errand, they must have found the slowness of the herd ahead of them irksome, and they would have passed it as soon as possible, merely to escape the dust cloud raised by the cattle. When the afternoon began to wane, the herd was far out in the basin, traveling steadily toward a point where the little river doubled, where Blackburn intended to camp for the night. And though both Blackburn and Lawler scanned the back trail intently at intervals, there was still no sign of the riders Garvin had mentioned, nor did the riders pass the herd in the night. Blackburn threw an extra guard around the cattle, making the shifts shorter and more frequent, and when daylight came a short conference among the Circle L men disclosed the news that no riders had passed. If any riders had passed, the cowboys must have seen them, for there had been a moon, and the basin afforded in the vicinity of the herd was clear and unobstructed. Enraged at the suspicious nature of the incident, Blackburn took half a dozen cowboys and rode back, while the remainder of the trail crew sent the herd eastward. It was late in the afternoon when Blackburn returned, disappointed, grim, and wrathful. "There is a bunch trailing us, all right," he told Lawler. "About a dozen. We seen where they'd stopped back in the Cayon a ways, where Garvin said he'd seen 'em sneakin' back. We lost their tracks there, for they merged with ours and we couldn't make nothing of 'em. But at the foot of the slope we picked 'em up again. Looks like they separated. Some of them went north and some went south. I reckon that during the night they sneaked around the edge of the basin. It is likely they're hiding in the timber somewhere watching us. If you say the word, I'll take some of the boys and rout 'em out. We'll find what they're up to, damn 'em. As long as they don't bother us, we won't bother them," said Lawler. "It is likely they won't bother us." Again that night the men worked in extra shifts, and the following morning the herd climbed out of the basin and straggled up a narrow trail through some foothills. At noon they passed through a defile between two mighty mountains, and when twilight came they had descended some low hills on the other side and went to camp for the night, on a big grass level near the river they had followed for 3 days. The level upon which they camped was much lower than the floor of the big basin, for the water from the river came tumbling out of a narrow gorge between the hills through which the herd had passed. They were in a wild section, picturesque, rugged. There was plenty of water, and Blackburn and Lawler both knew that there would be water enough for the herd all the way to Red Rock. There was a section of desert before them, which they would strike before many days, but they would cross the desert in 1 day, barring delay, and there seemed to be no reason why the long drive should not prove successful despite the mountain trails, most of them hazardous, through which they must still pass. And yet the men were restless. The continued presence of an invisible menace near them disturbed the men. They had not seen the mysterious riders again, but there was not a man in the outfit who did not feel them, not a man but was convinced that the riders were still trailing them, watching them. Long ago the younger men had ceased to laugh and joke. During the day they kept gazing steadily into the gulf of space that surrounded them, carefully scrutinizing the timber and the virgin brush which might form a covert. And at night they were sullen, expectant, every man wearing his gun when he rolled himself in his blanket. It was not fear that had seized them. They were rugged, hardy, courageous men who had looked death in the face many times, defying it, mocking it, and no visible danger could have disturbed them. But this danger was not visible. It was stealthy, secret, lurking near them, always threatening, always expected. It might stalk behind them. It might be flanking them as they rode, or it might creep upon them in the night. Blackburn had fallen into a vicious mood. His eyes glowed with the terrible, futile rage that surged in his veins. It was a reflection of a wrath that grew more and more intolerant as the days passed and the danger that portended did not materialize. "Boss," he said to Lawler on the 10th day following that on which Garvin had reported the presence of the riders behind them, "the boys is gettin' jumpy. They're givin' one another short answers, and they're growlin' about things they never noticed before. I'm gettin' fed up on this thing, too. It is a cinch. Them riders is following us. I seen 'em dustin' north of us this mornin'. I ain't said anything to the boys, but it is likely they've seen 'em too, for they've got their eyes peeled. It is gettin' under my skin, and if they don't come out into the open pretty soon and give us an idea of what game they're playing, me and some of the boys is going to drag 'em out." Yet Blackburn did not carry out his threat. He knew pursuit of the riders would be futile, for there were no further signs of them for several days, and Blackburn knew the riders would have no trouble in eluding them in the vast wilderness through which the herd had been passing for a week. They went on, continuing to watch, though there were no further signs of the men. They had been on the trail 20 days when at dusk one day they moved slowly down a wide, gradual slope toward a desert. At the foot of the slope was a water hole filled with a dark, brackish fluid with a green scum fringing its edges. The slope merged gently into the floor of the desert, like an ocean beach stretching out into the water, and for a distance out into the floor of the desert there was bunch grass, mesquite, and greasewood where the cattle might find grazing for the night. Beyond the stretch of grass spread the dead, gray dust of the desert, desolate in the filmy, mystic haze that was slowly descending. The cattle came down eagerly, for they had grazed little during the day in the mountainous region through which they had passed. They were showing the effects of the drive. They had been sleek and fat when they started from the Circle L. They were growing lean, wild, and they were always ravenously hungry. But where they could feed they required little attention, and the cowboys, after halting them, helped Garvin establish the lines of a rope corral into which they drove the centromuta. Then they built a fire and squatted wearily around it, at a respectful distance, to watch the cook and to listen to him as he complainingly prepared supper. The men had finished, and the long shadows of the dusk were stealing out over the desert when Lawler, sitting on the chuck box, heard Blackburn exclaim sharply, "Hell's fire, here they come." When Blackburn had sprung to his feet, his eyes blazing with the pent-up wrath that had been in them for many days. He was tense, his muscles straining, and his fingers were moving restlessly near the butt of the huge pistol that swung at his hip. The fingers were closing and unclosing, betraying the man's passion. Lawler got to his feet. Following the direction of Blackburn's flaming eyes, he saw, perhaps a mile away, a large body of horsemen. They were descending the long slope over which the herd had been driven. Lawler counted them, 39. But the menace was no longer invisible. It was now a material thing which could be met on such terms as might be, with the law of chance to govern the outcome. Lawler did not doubt that the oncoming riders were hostile. He had felt that when he first had been made aware of their presence behind the herd. He saw, too, that the men of his outfit felt as he did, for they were all on their feet, their faces grim, their eyes glowing with the rage that had gripped them over the presence of the unseen menace. Their muscles were tensed and their lips were in the sullen pout which presages the imminence of action. Shorty, the tawny giant, was a terrible figure. He seemed to be outwardly cool, and there was not a sign of passion in his manner. His hands swung limply at his sides, not a muscle in his body seeming to move. Unlike the other men, he was calm, seemingly unperturbed. So striking was the contrast between him and the other men that Lawler looked twice at him, and the second time he saw Shorty's eyes, they were gleaming pools of passion. Cold, repressed, easy. "Boys," Lawler called to the men, "don't let them suspect you know they've been trailing us. They've got us 2 to 1, almost. If they mean trouble, we'll have to work easy." He saw the men relax, and several of them resumed their former positions at the fire. The strange riders were coming steadily onward. They were not more than 100 yards distant when Blackburn exclaimed hoarsely, "Lawler, it is Blondie Antrim, and his gang, damn his hide. We're in for it." For the first time since Garvin had told him of the presence of the men on the trail behind the herd, Lawler's face betrayed passion. The glow in his eyes rivaled that in the giant's during the past year or so. Word had reached him, rumor unfounded but insistent, that more than once Singleton and Blondie Antrim, the outlaw, had been seen together. He had placed no credence in the rumors, ascribing them to the imaginations of mischievous brains, prejudiced against Singleton because of his bluff, dominant manner. He first had suspected there might be truth in them when Joe Hamlin had told him that he had rustled cattle for Singleton. He now believed that Singleton had disposed of the stolen cattle through Antrim, and the conviction that Singleton was behind the action of the outlaw in trailing the herd through the country seized him. In an instant, following Blackburn's exclamation, he was aroused to the danger that confronted himself and his men. As though by previous arrangement, the men looked at him, noted the tenseness that had come over him, listened attentively when he spoke. "Boys, don't offer to throw a gun. I know Antrim. He is a killer, and his men are like him. Take it easy. Keep cool. The man who loses his temper will be guilty of the wholesale murder that will follow. When Antrim rides up, send him after me." He had not unsaddled Red King. He strode to the horse, swung into the saddle, and rode eastward, away from the advancing riders. Blank astonishment, puzzled bewilderment shone in the eyes of the circle, Lel men as they watched him, and into the hearts of some of them crept the conviction that Lawler had deserted them, that he was afraid of the outlaw chief. Blackburn saw what they thought, and his burning eyes bored into them with sarcasm unutterable. He laughed, hoarsely, with a grim mirth that startled them. "Don't you worry about Lawler's nerve, boys. He has got more of it than the bunch of us put together. He has got some scheme in mind. You guys just sit tight until you find out what it is. Do as he told you. Don't let that scurvy gang know that you're flabbergasted." When Lawler rode away, there was a noticeable commotion in the group of advancing horsemen. One of them left the group, spurring his horse in the direction taken by Lawler. He must have been called back, for he wheeled his horse after he had ridden a dozen paces or so, and rejoined the group, which came on as before. When the horsemen came to a halt near the fire, they were spread in a semicircle about the circle L men, and in their bronzed, immobile faces was no answer to the question that agitated Blackburn and the other men. They had halted at a little distance from the fire, and one of them, a tall, slender, keen, hide. Thin-lipped man urged his horse out of the circle and insolently inspected Blackburn and his cowboys. He lounged loosely in the saddle. There was a sinister light in his eyes, a lurking threat in his manner. "What outfit is this?" he demanded. "Circle L from Wolf River," answered Blackburn. "Where you headin'?" "To Red Rock. Railroad out of business," jeered the outlaw. "Far as the Circle L is concerned, it is, Antrim," smiled Blackburn. "We had a fuss and quit him." The outlaw peered intently at the other. Then he grinned. "It is Andy Blackburn," he said. "Glad to meet you, Blackburn. This seems like old times, before the railroad went through, when old Luke Lawler used to jam him to Red Rock. Sometimes, when he didn't pick up too many strays on the way." He laughed as though pleased over the recollection. "Got this stock vented, Blackburn." "Nary a vent, Antrim." The inspector wasn't feelin' in the humor. "Huh," exclaimed Antrim. "So you didn't get no vent? Well, we're aimin' to look through your herd. We've been missin' cattle all summer. From my ranch, the Circle Bar, about 3,000 head. We've traced 'em as far as Kinney's Cayon and lost 'em. But we've been thinkin', Blackburn, that it ain't no hard job to make a passable Circle L out of a Circle Bar. That is why we aim to look your cattle over." He grinned slightly at Blackburn's scowl. Aware of the impotent rage the latter felt over the worst insult that could be offered an honest cattleman. For an instant he watched Blackburn keenly, his lips sneering, and then when he saw that Blackburn had mastered his rage, he said sharply, "Who was that guy that rode away as we come up?" "Lawler," said Blackburn. "He is figurin' on seeing you alone, looks like. He left word that when you come I was to tell you he wanted to see you." The outlaw's eyes glowed with swift suspicion. "He knowed me, eh?" he said. He glanced keenly over the level floor of the desert. Dimly, in the dusk, he could see Lawler riding near the herd. For an instant, Antrim hesitated, plainly debating the wisdom of leaving his men. Then he smiled with whimsical recklessness, and his movements became rapid, jerky. "Slade," he said, addressing a rider near him, "you're running things till I get back." He wheeled his horse and sent him into the dusk toward the herd, riding cautiously, evidently not entirely convinced of the peaceableness of Lawler's intentions. He rode a quarter of a mile before he came upon Lawler, and though the light was fading, he could plainly see Lawler's face, set, expressionless. The outlaw brought his horse to a halt within 3 or 4 paces of Red King. Antrim's manner exuded the insolent tolerance of the master, who has the confidence that comes from thoughts of an overwhelming advantage. He knew Lawler, knew him as perhaps no other man in the section knew him, for he had seen Lawler using his gun. It had been some years before, when Lawler had been proving himself, proving that he had a right to the respect and consideration of his fellow men, proving that no man could trifle with him. Antrim had been a witness to the shooting. He had marked Lawler's coolness, the evenness of his temper, and had noted the deadly swiftness and precision of his movements when he had drawn his pistol. Lawler had not been the aggressor. A dozen other men had testified to that. Antrim had not seen Lawler since, until now, and as he looked at him he saw that the years had brought a change in the man. He had been a tall, bold, reckless-looking youth then, with a certain wild waywardness in his manner that might have destroyed him, had he yielded to it. Now he was cold, calm, deliberate, imperturbable. The recklessness had disappeared from his eyes. They were now aglow with quiet determination. The waywardness had gone. Iron-like resolution marked his manner, and yet behind it all, Antrim could see the thread of those youthful passions, the lurking eagerness for violent action, the hint of preparedness, of readiness. Antrim was startled, uneasy. He saw now that he should not have left his men, that he had made a mistake in coming alone to meet Lawler. He was certain of it now, when he heard Lawler's voice, saw the cold, smiling light in his eyes. "You're wanting my cattle, Antrim. Your men have been trailing me for 2 weeks. You don't get them. You've got 39 men, and there are only 23 Circle L men over there. I'm not getting any of them killed. This thing is between you and myself. Get your hand away from your gun or I'll bore you." He moved his hand where it had been, seemingly lying on Red King's neck under the mane, and Antrim saw the dark muzzle of a pistol showing in the hand. "I'm not taking any chances, Antrim. You can see that. I'm not going to take any. If you do anything to attract the attention of your men, I'll kill you. Drop your guns using your thumbs and forefingers." He waited, watching keenly, until the outlaw had complied with the demand. the two big pistols thudding dully into the sand beside his horse. Then Lawler resumed, his voice low and even as before. Now we're riding back to the fire, Antrim. Listen hard, for this means life or death to you. We're going back to the fire. You're going to act as though nothing had happened. And you are to tell your men that you have changed your mind about the cattle. You are to tell them that you are going with me to Red Rock, and you are sending them back to where you came from, to wait for you. Antrim stiffened, and his face bloated poisonously. But he did not answer, for there was that in Lawler's eyes that convinced him of the futility of attempting resistance. You're going to Red Rock with me, went on Lawler. I'm going to be personally responsible for you. I'm going to watch you. You're going to ride ahead of me. If you talk or make any motion that brings any of your men back, you'll die so quick you won't know it happened. Do you understand? Damn you, Lawler, you'll pay for this, muttered the outlaw. I'll go on your trail and I'll never let up till I get you. Lawler laughed lowly. Just be careful not to get any of that poison in your voice when you tell your men what I told you, Antrim, or you'll never go on anybody's trail. Get going now, and be careful. Antrim wheeled his horse, and Lawler spurred Red King beside him. I'll be watching you, Antrim, he warned. If your men show they suspect anything wrong, you go down, mighty rapid. You don't get off your horse until your men go, and there is to be no playing for time. You talk fast and earnest and carefully. Go ahead. Riding slightly in Antrim's rear, Lawler followed the outlaw to the fire. There had come no change in the positions of the outlaws or of the circle hell men, and when Antrim and Lawler rode up there was a silence during which the men of both factions looked interrogatively at their leaders. Antrim's face was pale, and his voice was vibrant with emotion, but he did not hesitate. Slade, he said to the man he had left in charge, I've changed my mind about those cattle. Lawler has given me proof that none of our stock is with them. I'm hitting the trail to Red Rock with Lawler. You take the boys back to the ranch and wait for me. Slade's eyes widened. He flushed and peered keenly at Antrim. You, why hell's fire, Antrim, Slade, do as I tell you, said Antrim, coldly. Are you running my affairs? You hit the breeze right now. You hear me? Slade grinned venomously and waved a violent hand around the circle. You hear your boss, boys, he said. Slope. The men hesitated an instant, sending sharp, incredulous glances at their leader, but Antrim, pale, knowing that if he betrayed the slightest sign of insincerity his men would suspect, met their look steadily. The men wheeled their horses, muttering profanely, and rode slowly westward into the growing darkness. When they had disappeared, Lawler smiled faintly at the outlaw chief. You can get down now, Antrim. He drew the pistol from Red King's mane where it had been concealed during Antrim's talk with his men, and sheathed it, and then Blackburn, who had been a silent, amazed witness to what had occurred, whistled softly, covertly poking Shorty in the ribs. There is one thing that is as good as a vent, ain't there, Shorty, he said. That is a gun in the hand of a man who has got plenty of nerve.
Chapter 15. Concerning an Outlaw.
Early in the afternoon of the first day of December, the sky darkened, and a cold, raw wind began to shriek through Willets. The company corral was empty, and again, as on the day before Cain Lawler had visited him, Gary Warden stood at one of the windows of his office smiling. Warden was almost satisfied. Only one disturbing thought persistently recurred. Lawler had got his cattle through to Red Rock. A crimson stain appeared in Warden's cheeks as his thoughts reverted to Lawler's return to Willets, after disposing of his cattle to the Red Rock buyer, and Warden's shoulders sagged a little. The smile faded, and he glared malignantly at the bleak, gray clouds that sailed over town on the chill, bitter wind. Oddly, at the instant, Warden's memory was dwelling upon the incident of Lawler's return to Willets. Leif Corwin, the storekeeper, was mentally reviewing the incident. Willets was a cow town, and for the winter, its activity was over. All the beef cattle in the section, with the exception of 3,000 head still held by Lawler at the Circle L, had been shipped eastward, and Willets would now descend to supine indifference to considerations of gain. Leif Corwin was tilted back in a big wooden chair near the big, roaring, hot stove in the lounging room of the Willets Hotel. His clerk could attend to the store until spring came. Corwin would spend much of his leisure near the big stove in the hotel, talking politics and cattle, two subjects of paramount importance. But just at this instant, Corwin was thinking of Lawler's return to Willets. Little wrinkles gathered around his eyes, which were twinkling, and he chuckled lowly as his gaze roved from one to the other of the men who, like himself, were enjoying the warmth of the stove and listening, between words, to the howling and moaning of the wind. 3 or 4 times during silences, Corwin chuckled, and when at last he saw Dave Rankin, the blacksmith, watching him curiously, he guffawed aloud, rubbing his hands gleefully. "I don't reckon I ever seen no mournfuller sight than that," he declared. "Me neen." "Which?" asked the blacksmith, his eyes alight with truculent inquiry. The others sat erect, attentive. "Me neen that mornin', when Kane Lawler hopped off the train with his bunch of cowans." "And Blondie Antrim," snickered Corwin. "Dave Singleton, and Gary Warden, and Jordan, and Simmons, and that pony built girl which is stayin' over to the 2 Diamond with that ossified woman she calls Aunt Hannah, was on the platform waitin' for the 6 o'clock train from the east. It appears that pony built Della Warden, her name is, was expectin' some gimcracks, and Warden and her was waitin' for them. Anyways, they was there. It sure was medium mournful," declared Corwin. He appeared to hesitate, and Rankin grinned. "We've heard it before, but I reckon we can stand listenin' agin. Tell it, Corwin." "As I was sighin' when you interrupted me, it was medium mournful," resumed Corwin. "Shorty, who was with Lawler on the drive, has told me since, but at that time I didn't know, that Jordan had refused to vent Lawler's cattle. Well, I'd come down to see the train come in, too. We was all standin' there when she come a-steamin' up, and stop. And who clum off but Lawler and his trail crew, 23 of 'em, and Blondie Antrim in the midst of 'em lookin' like a sheep-killin' dog. Well, gentlemen, they was a scene. Warden got his face all screwed up, and couldn't get it unscrewed agin. He looked like he'd swallered a hot brand and iron, and it didn't lay easy on his stomach. Singleton was a-standin' there with his mouth open, and his eyes a-poppin' out, and Jordan was plumb flabbergasted. Simmons was leanin', eggin' the side of the station buildin', lookin' like he was expectin' to be shot the next minute. That Della Wharton girl was the only one that seemed to have any wits at all. I seen her grin eloquent at Lawler, and look him straight in the eye like she was tellin' him something intimate. Well, as I was sayin', Lawler and his boys got off with Blondie Antrim. Antrim looks wild and flighty, like you've seen a locoed steer on the prod. His eyes was a-glarin', and he was mutterin' cusses by the mouthful, all of which didn't seem to faze Lawler none. Lawler was as cool as an iceberg which had just arove from the North Pole, and then some. And he got a mean, mild grin on his face when he saw the reception committee that had come to meet him. There was a twinkle in his eyes when he looked at Della Wharton, but when Warden blows into his line of vision, he looked mighty wicked. Lawler and his gang had brought their hosses from Red Rock in 2 cars. They'd sold some of the Sorn Renmuda in Red Rock, not caring to ship 'em home. Anyways, the gang didn't appear in no hurry to unload the hosses, and a trainman yells to them, signing they'd have to hurry. But the boys was too interested just then. "Unload 'em yourself, you sufferin' yap," yells Shorty. "If you pull out of here with them hosses, I'll blow your damned railroad over into the next county." Shorty sure does love the railroad. As I was sighin' when you interrupted me, Lawler looked mighty wicked, but he is cold and polite. And common he escorts Antrim over to where Warden was standin', and says quiet and low, "Warden, I have brought back my vent. He sure was a heap of trouble, and he got himself attached to us right close. But as we haven't got no further use for him, we're turnin' him over to you. I reckon he is lookin' to you and Singleton to pay him for the trouble of trailin' us for 2 weeks, and for keepin' me company as far as Red Rock, to see that my herd got there right and proper. Antrim," he says, "go to your boss," and he gives him a little shove toward Warden. Warden didn't say nothin'. He'd lost his voice, I reckon, but Antrim goes off the handle complete. "The damned sneak lifted my guns," he yells. "You wantin' a gun," says Lawler, coldin'. He backs up and lifts one of Shorty's. Then he walks close to Antrim and shoves it into his right hand. "There is a gun, you polecat," he says. "Fan it. I'd admire to blow the gizzard out'n you." But Antrim didn't seem to be none tickled now that he'd got the gun. He stood, looking at it like it was something strange and unusual, and he was wonderin' whether he ought to hang on to it or drop it. Finally, he grins sorta sheepish-like and hands it back to Lawler butt first. "I ain't aimin' to fight you today, Lawler," he says, his face bloomin' like a cactus. Lawler laughs and gives Shorty his gun back. Shorty grins like a tiger. "Maybe Singleton wouldn't mind accepting your kind offer, boss," he says. "But Singleton don't break his neck reachin' for Tootie Hused gun. Neither." He stands there, looking like a calf that has lost its mother. And then Lawler laughs again and says, "Well, boys, seeing that the reception committee has received us and the honors has all been done, I reckon we'd better get the hosses off the cars and hit the breeze for home." And they done so. But before they went, they smoked up the town considerable, as you all seen. Them boys had divided $25,000 between them, which Lawler give 'em for making the drive. And they sure did celebrate. Except Lawler. He went right home, and I ain't seen him since. But I reckon Warden and the rest of them ain't had no regrets. I ain't never seen no mournfuller sight than them, folks sneaking away from the station. All but Della Warden. She was a grinnin' sorta like as though something pleased her.
Chapter 16. A Norther.
When Lawler returned to the Circle L ranch house, he found that Mary had gone east to school. She had left for Willits on the second day following Lawler's departure, and Mrs. Lawler had already received 2 letters from her. Mrs. Lawler watched her son keenly when she told him that Joe Hamlin had brought a letter stating that Hamlin was to be permitted to take a number of mixed cattle from the Circle L, and that he had driven away 100. She smiled gently when she told Lawler that on the day before her departure, Mary had visited Ruth Hamlin, had spent the whole day with her, and had come home mysteriously delighted. Ruth had given up the school. "Mary loves her, Kane," said Mrs. Lawler, and she smiled again when she saw a flush reach Lawler's face. Lawler intended to ride to the Hamlin cabin this morning. It was the 3rd day following his arrival at the ranch, and until now he had had no time for anything except to attend to the many details of work that had been neglected during his absence. There were still 3,000 head of cattle on the Circle L range. The men had held them in the valley for a time during his absence on the trail, but the grass had grown sparse, and the herd was now grazing on the big plain beyond the northern slope of the valley. During the time he had been home, the outfit had been busy. The Circle L had a dozen line camps, little adobe cabins scattered over the range, occupied during the winter by Circle L cowboys whose duty it was to guard the cattle against the aggressions of timber wolves, rustlers, cold, and starvation. For 2 days, the chuck wagon had been sent rattling to the various line camps, stocking them with supplies against the winter. As the weather was threatening, the hoodlum wagon had been pressed into service this morning, and all the men, with the exception of the blacksmith, who was working diligently in his shop near the corral, and 2 punchers, Davies and Harris, who had been assigned to number 1 camp, were away with the 2 wagons. Davies and Harris had not been able to resist the lure of town. The prosperity that had descended upon them had made them restless, and the night before they had importuned Lawler to permit them to spend 1 more night in town before hauling up for the winter. Lawler had consented, and now he was wishing that he hadn't. For when he emerged from the ranch house this morning, he saw a dark cloud bank far in the north, moving southward on the chill wind. The herd, he knew, was somewhere on the big level beyond the slope of the valley, in the vicinity of number 1 line camp. It was an isolated section off the trail that led to town, a section of featureless level near a big break in the valley. The break opened upon another big level that stretched southward for 100 miles. In other days, Luke Lawler had lost many cattle here. They had drifted through the break by hundreds with a blizzard behind them, and had been swallowed by the Great Waste 2 years before. Aware of the previous losses, Lawler had erected a wire fence across the big break, extending from a craggy mountain wall on the western end to a sheer butte that marked the end of the break eastward. Lawler had sent Red King to the crest of the valley on his way to the Hamlin cabin, when he noted that the cloud bank in the north had grown denser nearer. The wind had increased in velocity, and he had to lean against it as he rode, and it was so cold and raw that he drew his heavy cap down over his eyes to shield them, and drew over his mouth the heavy woolen scarf he wore around his neck. He rode on a short distance, casting troubled glances into the north. He found himself wondering if Davies and Harris had gone to the line camp. If they hadn't, and a storm broke, the herd on the big level was in danger. He brought Red King to a halt. The big horse pranced, whistling eagerly. He champed on the bit, tossed his head, raising it finally and staring straight into the north. "You see it too, eh, King?" said Lawler. "Well, we can't take that chance. We'll have to go to the camp." He headed Red King down into the valley again, where the bitter wind did not strike them, riding westward rapidly. It was noon before Lawler and Red King had traveled half the distance to the line camp. A dull, gray haze was sweeping southward. It mingled with the southern light and threw a ghostly glare into the valley, making distance deceptive, giving a strange appearance to the landmarks with which Lawler and the horse were familiar. Lawler increased Red King's pace. He saw that the storm was nearer than he had thought, and he would have to work fast to get the cattle headed into the valley before it broke. The distance from the Circle Ranch house to the big plain near the line cabin was about 15 miles, and the trail led upward in a long, tiresome rise. Yet Red King struck the level with a reserve strength that was betrayed by the way he fought for his head as he saw the level stretch before him. He was warmed up. He wanted to run, but Lawler drew him down in an effort to locate the herd before he started toward it. Man and horse made a mere blot on the yawning expanse of land that stretched away from them in all directions. A lone eagle in the sky or a mariner adrift on a deserted sea could not have seemed more isolated than Lawler and Red King. In this limitless expanse of wasteland, horse and rider were dwarfed to the proportion of atoms. The yawning, aching, stretching miles of level seemed to have no end. Several miles into the north, Lawler saw the herd. Directly westward, at a distance of about a mile, he saw the line cabin. No smoke was issuing from the chimney, and so far as he could discern, there were no men with the cattle. Harris and Davies had overstayed. That knowledge might have been responsible for the grim humor in Lawler's eyes, but the rigidness of his body and the aggressive thrust to his chin were caused by knowledge of a different character. The storm was about to break. The sun was casting a dull red glow through the gray haze. It was blotted out as he looked. Southward from the horizon ends extended a broad sea of shimmering, glittering sky that contrasted brilliantly to the black, wind-whipped clouds that had gathered in the north. Fleecy gray wisps, detached from the heavy, spreading mass northward, were scurrying southward, streaking the shimmering brilliance and telling of the force of the wind that drove them. A wailing note came from the north, a sighing vague with a portent of force, a whisper of unrest, a promise of fury. Far in the north, its blackness deepening with distance, stretched the menace, arousing awe with its magnitude. Nature seemed to know what impended, for on the vast level where the storm would have a clear sweep, the dried grass, bronzed by the searing autumn sun, was rustling as it bent far southward. The hardy sage bowed reluctantly to the fitful blasts, and the scraggly, ugly yucca resentfully yielded to the unseen force. A wide, shallow gully ran northwestward from a point near Red King, almost in a straight line toward the herd. Lawler urged the big horse into the gully and rode hard. The distance was several miles, but when Red King came to the gully end, he flashed out of it like a streak of red flame. He was drawn down instantly, however, snorting and pawing impatiently. While Lawler shielded his eyes with his hands and again scanned the country, he saw the herd, and as he watched it began to move. There were no men near the cattle. They started slowly, seemingly reluctant to leave the level. They moved sullenly, closely massed, their heads lowered, their tails drooping. The wind, now beginning to carry a vicious note with its whine, drove a heavy dust cloud against them, warning them. The wind was icy, giving the cattle a foretaste of what was to come, and mingling with the dust were fine, flinty snow particles that came almost horizontally against their rumps, stinging them, worrying them. They increased their pace, and soon were running with a swinging, awkward stride, straight toward the wire fence several miles distant. If they saw Lawler, they gave no sign, for they went lumbering on, snorting and bawling their apprehension. Lawler was about to start Red King toward them, when he noted movement on the level a little northwestward from the cattle. Peering intently, he saw two horsemen racing southward, a little distance ahead of the cattle, parallel with them. At first, Lawler was certain the men were Davies and Harris, and he smiled, appreciating their devotion to duty. But when he saw them race past the cattle, not even halting to head them in the right direction, which would have been slightly eastward so that they would enter the valley before reaching the fence, he frowned, wheeled Red King sharply, and sent him back into the gully from which he had emerged. "They're strangers, King," he said, shortly to the horse as the latter fled headlong down the gully toward the point from which he had started. Davies and Harris wouldn't leave the herd with that norther coming on. The big horse made fast time down the gully. He brought Lawler to a point near the fence where it crossed the gully at about the instant. The two riders were dismounting some distance away. Lawler rode out of the gully and brought Red King to a halt. There was no danger that the two men would discover him, for all objects in the vicinity were rapidly being blotted out by the dancing smother of dust that was riding the north wind. Lawler was to the north of the men, slightly eastward, and they could not have faced the smother of dust to look toward him. Lawler could dimly see the herd moving toward the fence. He could see the men plainly, and as he watched them, his eyes narrowed. The big horse leaped with the word he caught from his rider's lips, racing lightly with the wind toward the fence where the men were working. Lawler's approach was noiseless, for all sound was engulfed in the steady roaring whine of the storm. Neither of the two men working at the fence heard Lawler as he brought the big horse to a halt within half a dozen paces of them. The taller of the two, plying a pair of wire nippers, completed his work at a fence post and turned to leap toward another. The movement brought him against the muzzle of Lawler's horse. He halted jerkily, retreated a step, and looked up to see Lawler looking at him from behind the muzzle of the big pistol that had leaped into his hand. There was no word spoken, none could be heard at the moment. What followed was grim pantomime, with tragedy lurking near. The tall man held his position. He had tentatively extended his right hand, the fingers spread, claw-like. Now the hand was going upward, accompanied by the other. When the man had stepped backward to escape a collision with Lawler's horse, the wind had whipped his hat from his head. He now stood there, his hair waving to the vicious whims of the gale, veiling his eyes, and he not daring to lower his hands to brush it away. The shorter man, too, had assumed a statuesque pose. He had turned when he had noted his companion's startled movement, and he, too, had seen an apparition that had sent his hands swiftly upward. The big horse stood motionless, his back to the wind. He did not move as Lawler leaped from his back. Smoothly, quickly, his eyes alert, his muscles tensed for violent action. The men stood rigid while Lawler jerked their pistols from their holsters and tossed them into the dust waves that danced and swirled around them. The short man was catapulted against the tall one with a viciousness that staggered both. And then they heard Lawler's voice, sharp and penetrating. Above the shrieking of the wind, "Those cattle will be here in 5 minutes. If you don't have that fence repaired before then, you drift with them, hoofing it." In the allotted time they repaired the fence, working with breathless energy, while Lawler stood near, the menacing gun in hand, a saturnine smile wreathing his face. When the herd reached the fence, there was no break in it. More, where the break had been were 3 men on horses who took instant charge, easing the cattle down along the fence, heading them eastward toward the shelter they were sure to find if they kept going. The 3 men followed the cattle for a mile, until they were going straight and fast toward the home ranch. Then Lawler, smiling with bitter humor, motioned the men toward the back trail. They seemed to know what was demanded of them. They wheeled their horses, sending them into the billowy white smother that was now coming in a gigantic wave toward them. The southern light had gone. A dense blackness, out of which roared a gale that robbed them of their breath, struck them. The snow was hurled against them like a sand blast, biting deep, blinding them. It took them more than an hour to travel the distance that lay between the point at which they had cut the fence and the line cabin, and when they reached a windbreak near the structure, the 2 men rode behind it, silent, thankful. Lawler had ridden forth, prepared for bad weather. His face was now muffled in a huge scarf that encircled his neck, and his eyes were shielded by the peak of the fur cap he wore. He dismounted, waved the men toward a dugout, and watched them as they dismounted and led their horses through a narrow door. When the men emerged, Lawler led the big red horse in, leaving the men to stand in the white gale that enveloped them. The wind was now roaring steadily, and with such force that no man could have faced it with uncovered face. It came over the vast emptiness of the northern spaces with a fury that sent into one the consciousness that here was an element with which man could not cope. Lawler emerged from the dugout and closed the door behind him. He barred it, turned, and motioned the 2 men toward the cabin. He followed them as they opened the door and entered. Then, after closing the door and barring it, he lifted the peak of his cap, removed the scarf from his neck, glanced around the interior of the cabin, and looked coldly at the men. "Well," he said, "there is a heap of explaining to be done. You can begin now, one at a time."